I also want to say I'm delighted to be sharing a panel with a feminist philosopher of Melda Yaman and the indigenous philosopher of Wapeemukwa, each of whom have written original material on the late Marx. Okay, so the late Marx and today's challenges. The vision and scope of Marx's last years, just like for those who aren't ultra familiar with this, just the kinds of things he was writing on in his last years, 1869 to 82. Well, colonialism and revolution, especially in Ireland, India, and Algeria. Communal social formations, which he sometimes called primitive communism, which and rethinking the very idea of communism as a way of life, looking at villages in India, Algeria, Russia, the Paris Commune in his own time and his own geography. All these were in his own time, and Native American societies. And I think I mentioned Russia. If I didn't, I should have. Gender is very prominent here uh, in his discussions of the indigenous Americas, ancient Greece and Rome and Ireland. And Engels, of course, singled this out, as we know, in his famous book, Origin of the Family. But Marx is less reductionist, if you will, and a lot of other things than Engels. This is something that Melda has written quite a bit on. Uh, Communal social formations as loci of revolution. This is something I emphasize a lot in my book, not only in Russia, but also India and Algeria, how Marx sees revolutionary movements emerging, and of course, the Paris Commune itself. And then I want to just underline that for Marx, it's never purely historical research, especially with Russia and Ireland. It's very clear it's not only analysis of revolutionary possibilities, but intervention, political intervention in ongoing revolutionary movements. But even with indigenous America, Marx, unlike Engels, thinks that these communal social formations survive much more into the present and therefore are active human subjects. Okay, clear changes. We could say Marx stretched himself, but of course Fanon didn't know this Marx. It wasn't well known. Uh, okay, what are the changes from earlier Marx? Well, obviously, the less Eurocentric, more focused on gender. Okay, some examples. The directionality of revolution. He now often sees it as coming not from Europe and spreading, from a proletarian revolution outward, but Ireland at one point, or on the western periphery of Europe, or Russia on the eastern periphery, would be where the revolution might well begin. India at one point he mentions as at more than one point he mentions as well. Gender is central in new ways. Yes, Marx had written a lot on gender in his youth, and there's other points. I mean, Heather Brown has the most systematic study of all that, and I hope she'll say something later. But particularly in these pre-capitalist societies like the Iroquois, he's looking at that. But even in the Paris Commune, he has a couple paragraphs on gender. I think I've read almost all of his writings on the 1848 revolutions. I don't recall anything as substantial on women, yet I'm sure that we know that women were participating importantly, in important ways in 1848. Another thing that changes with him is in his earlier writings, he actually views the communal village in places like India or Russia as the solid support for Oriental despotism, as he calls it in a rather Eurocentric manner in the early 1850s. Not only is it, and of course, Max Weber continued to think that this was why Russia couldn't progress, but Marx clearly changes his position on this, starting to view this pre-capitalist communism, at least in its origin, as a loci of revolution, particularly in Ireland, particularly in Russia, but always with the idea of linking up with the Western proletariat, solidarity, as was being discussed a few minutes ago. Also on the state. Well, most of these societies he's looking at, even if it's a village under an empire or colonialism, it's not, it has a little bit of autonomy from the state. And some of the societies he's looking at, like the Iroquois, are totally stateless. And of course, the Paris Commune is stateless. So, and of course, in his writings on the Paris Commune, he makes clear, he says, I'm changing my position from the Communist Manifesto. That's what he and Engels say in 1872. Okay, third third major thing, uh, late Marx has, as opposed to when Dunevsky wrote about it in the 1980s, or I even wrote about it 15 years ago, late Marx is now really a topic of discussion. There's a number of books, dozens of articles on this, and I think we can group the discussions into three categories. One, well, we have to defend Marx from Edward Said and all these people. He was not Eurocentric. He was always creative. In fact, he wasn't that bad in 1853 or 1848 either. He was always great. He always kept looking at creatively at stuff. Secondly, going to the other direction, after Capital, roughly speaking, Marx breaks with his past, is no longer a historical materialist, and therefore becomes a really creative thinker for our time in this last decade, that's talking about indigenous communism, getting rid of growth and productivism, and so forth. The third one is to reject both of these and to say that Marx moves and evolves from his earlier Eurocentrism with some major changes, such as I was outlining above, but these aren't breaks. These aren't total breaks. And of course, that's my own position, and that is that of Dunevsky, and that was early writings. And we can see these positions already crystallizing as early as 1983 in that book edited by Theodor Shanin, Marx and the Russian Road, where Shanin takes that position of like a almost total break between the late Marx and the Marx before Capital. Okay, D, fighting fascism and capitalism today, because that's after all why we're here. Okay, the 1870s and early 1880s was not exactly a flowering of revolution in the United States or Western Europe, which was the heartland of socialism at that time. The Paris Commune had been defeated, and it wasn't exactly like other revolutionary movements were sprouting all over Western Europe. In the United States, Reconstruction had been rolled back. So this is a period of conservative politics. But what did Marx do? Well, there was an attempted military coup in France in the late 1870s, and Marx said in a letter, he says, well, we've got to defend the Republic. Now, this is the same bourgeois republic that massacred the Paris Communards. So believe me, whatever, I don't know, Hillary Clinton did to us, it wasn't to that extent what she did to the left. So, we have to defend the democratic republic, I think, or Marx would have thought that. And we're in this weird position that we have to defend the University of California, Berkeley against Trump at the same extent that it's repressing us in this outrageous thing, if you're in academia, turning over lists of names of professors to the government, including Judith Butler. Okay, third, we don't stop at that, obviously. We don't stop at defending the liberal democratic republic in our struggle against fascism. Otherwise, you wouldn't be revolutionaries, you wouldn't be socialists. So we have to deepen our understanding of capitalism, and that we have to include more on gender, sexuality, and race colonialism, as well as obviously class and capital, not only in the struggle, but in doing deep research. This is a moment we want to all hit the streets, or we don't want to cower in our apartments, but we do want to hit the streets. But we can't give up on the theoretical agenda, which is what we're trying to do today at this meeting. And we have good examples from the past of that. It's in one of the worst periods of the left when World War I started and the socialist parties capitulated, that Lenin engaged in his Hegel notebooks. At the same time, he was calling for a turn the imperialist war into a class war, but he was doing both. Or our own tendency, the Johnson Forest tendency of C.L.R. James Rodneyevsky and Grace Lee Boggs, this was founded in the middle of Hitler, World War II beginning, Hitler controlling most of Europe, Stalin controlling most of the rest, war, and that's when they decided to found the new Marxist tendency. And that's when they did their research on state capitalism and started on race and class and so forth. And then Marxist-Humanism itself, the first Marxist-Humanist organization in the United States was founded in 1955. That was not a good year for the left, at least the first part of the year. And it's the height of McCarthyism still. And so, but they didn't just say fight McCarthy, regroup, keep to our old principles. They developed humanism, Marxism as humanism, which was new, at least in the English-speaking world at that time. So that's why we're having this meeting. We're creating the theoretical foundations to fight fascism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, heterosexism, it's easy to say that, harder to do it, and how to do it has to be motivated by deep theoretical reflection, not just looking at past things like how creative Marx was, but that should be an example for us of how to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, also for keeping time. You still have a few more minutes if you want to, but you can come back later
No
afterwards
problem.
also.
I'll talk later.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Melda, your turn.
Okay. Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Kevin. Hello, everybody. Greetings from Turkey. It's about 10 p.m. here, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I will discuss the importance of Marx's later ethnological studies in relation to socialist feminist theory and struggle. I will highlight only a few topics related to gender and socialist feminism. During the last years of his life, Marx devoted his attention to anthropology, He filled several notebooks known as ethnological notebooks. He placed particular importance on Morgan's Ancient Society, but quoted the work of many anthropologists. The notebooks cover a variety of topics, including primitive communism, family, and gender. In brief, in these late studies, Marx examined the origins of class, gender, the family, and the patriarchy. Marx often elaborates these issues in early works like the German ideology. The oppression and emancipation of women were recurring themes in his early writings. In his masterpiece, Capital, however, Marx addressed the question only in a limited way, focusing mainly on the harsh working conditions of women workers, without developing the so-called women question with the same richness. And he returned to these early subjects in ethnological notebooks. His ethnological studies also provided vivid evidence for his early insights into communal societies. Through his close engagement with Morgan's work on the Iroquois, Marx found concrete confirmation that private property is historically specific and transitory. Furthermore, he identified the germ of the future communist societies in these so-called primitive communities. So, these notebooks open an important dimension of his thought. On the one hand, they reveal continuities with his earlier philosophical anthropological reflections. On the other hand, they chart new directions. However, Marx's ethnological notebooks were largely ignored for decades, consulted only by Engels and a handful of scholars. 40 years after they were written, David Ryazanov brought these notebooks to light in the 1920s. Yet even Ryazanov, while editing the historical edition of Marx and Engels' works, dismissed these notebooks as mere inexcusable pedantry. In 1972, 89 years after Marx's death, Lawrence created transcribed and published part of the material as the ethnological notebooks of Karl Marx. Despite this long neglect, a few thinkers grasped their significance. For example, Dostoevskaya welcomed them as a historical event that allows us to read Marx's works in its totality. The reasons behind the marginalization of the ethnological notebooks are multiple and revealing. The first one is the widespread assumption that Marx's final years were dominated by illness. However, his final years can themselves be seen as evidence of the opposite. He worked tirelessly and immersed himself in dense readings. Kevin elaborates on this in detail in his recent book. Secondly, the fragmentary and unsystematic character of the notebooks. I want to say a few words about this. Ethnological notebooks, written in a dense mix of languages, pose significant challenges to readers. Franklin Rosemont, he was an American poet, artist, historian, compared them to the Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Unlike other unpublished texts such as the Grundrisse, Marx notes contain incomplete sentences, ironic comments attached to the long quotations, and they make them difficult to read. The excerpts sometimes interwoven with Marx's own reflections, therefore it is sometimes difficult to separate the two. As several scholars point out, they are often seen as research in progress rather than a finished work. Even so, the quotations, marginal notes, and commentaries offer insights into Marx's thinking. As Rosemont points out, these notes aren't just random fragments. They are the raw material of Marx's thought. Here, Marx was almost talking to himself, working out new ideas and circling back to old concerns, including the women question. The third issue is the belief that Marx has abandoned the capital project. I would like to say a few words about this too. Here is the question. Why did Marx, after publishing the first volume of Capital and while expected to prepare the second and third volumes for publication, turn so intensively to ethnological studies? Should these late investigations be viewed as a departure from the Capital, or rather as its continuation on a broader terrain? Ryazanov once criticized the old Marx for spending so much time on ethnological notes. He thought that it meant he had broke away from the Capital project. Similarly, Donald Cayley argued that in these notebooks, Marx was moving beyond the materialist conception of history, and he thought this was why he never finished Capital. By contrast, David Norman Smith argues that Marx's ethnology extended the critique of capitalism. It offers insights into its global reproduction and the dialectic between clan and class societies. Thomas Peterson, the writer of Karl Marx anthropologists, support this reading, stressing that Marx's turn to anthropology was not a departure, but a deepening of his critique of capitalism. Like Smith and Peterson, I argue that Marx's intensive ethnological research indicates a deepening and broadening of his critique. However, I would argue, as Smith notes, it wasn't just about the extended reproduction of capitalism. Rather, as Dostoevskaya points out, the real issue was the question of how total the uprooting of existing society must be. This recognized the question of kingship, family, and social reproduction were crucial for understanding the origins of class society and the conditions necessary for its revolutionary transformation. Therefore, the problem Marx confronted was the search for new forms of human relations, a new type of division of labor, ultimately a new type of society, egalitarian, classless, and free society. This vision was inseparable from the realization of human possibilities. From his early writings to the Grundrisse, Marx consistently returned to that question: how human potential could be fully realized through the abolition of class society. The ethnological notebooks therefore offer new perspectives on human relations, egalitarian communities, and realization of human potential. Overlooking them leaves these topics largely unexplored. But this neglect hides something crucial. In his late studies, Marx turned to the issues of gender, family, communal property, and women's emancipation. Ignoring the notebooks means missing their deep significance for socialist feminist theory and for imagining emancipatory alternatives to capitalism. Another reason that ethnological notebooks matter is that they shed light on Marx's
Söylediklerini duymakta güçlük çekiyorum.
to Engels' The Origin. The issue is how Marx often reflections connect with or diverge from the arguments Engels put forward in that work. From a Marxist feminist perspective, it is crucial. The key issue is whether Engels' account of the patriarchal family, women's subordination, and the property class gender nexus derives from Marx's ethnological studies or it represents a distinct theoretical move. After Marx's death, Engels examined the ethnological manuscripts Marx had left behind. Recognizing the Marx's extensive notes on Morgan, he concluded that his friend had intended to write a major work on ancient society. Engels undertook to complete the project himself. He wrote that the origin was only a meager substitute for what Marx might have written. However, Marx's precise intentions remain uncertain. The relationship between the origin and ethnological notebooks has long been a subject of debate. Some scholars point to methodological divergence, noting that Marx's notebooks are grounded in a dialectic mode of analysis, whereas Engels' approach appears less dialectical. In addition, several researchers contend that Marx employed a multilinear conception of social development, while Engels tended toward a unilinear scheme. One of the most significant points of divergence between the origin and the ethnological notebooks concerns Engels' formulation of the world historic defeat of female sex. Engels argued that early societies were characterized by matriarchal structures, and he believed that it was confirmed by Morgan's research. Marx, by contrast, offered no such endorsement in his notes. His ethnological notes suggest no acceptance of the historical primacy of matriarchy. Engels explained the origins of women's oppression by placing the property of herds at the center of his analysis, whereas Marx did not assign it such emphasis. Whereas Engels explained the patriarchal family primarily through subjective motives, man's desire to transmit property to their sons. Marx situated the issue in relation to objective social dynamics. He focused on the formation of ranks and the evolving power relations between chiefs and the broader community. For Marx, the rise of patriarchy was rooted in the same historical dynamics that also produced private property. Like Hegel, he understood human society as a process of becoming, propelled by contradictions as the motor of historical change. Accordingly, Marx concentrated on the internal contradictions of communal societies. As Crader highlights, Marx showed how the principle of the gens contained its own negation in the emergence of ranks, castes, and the social stratification. In brief, he showed that oppression in general and the suppression of women in particular arose from within primitive communism. Another but essential problem with the notion of the world historic defeat is that it ignores the struggle of women in the emergence of patriarchy. It also portrays women as passive, submissive victims rather than active, persistent, history-making subjects. It therefore postpones the emancipation of women until an indefinite time. However, for Marx, in the historical development, human beings are main subject, man and woman acting, self-actualizing, reproducing themselves and the society. As Marx did not stop in his historical stage as if it were ultimate, he didn't take the rise of patriarchy as an end. What is essential for Marx was the ongoing struggle for a new form of human relationship, a new form of society. This is a society in which all the women and men would realize all their human possibilities. The vision is connected to concretizing the human possibilities he developed in the Grundrisse. So, as Ward Gailey puts it, what we see throughout Marx's notebooks is a dialectical return. What Marx found in Morgan is the problem of what is newest in what is oldest. In short, ethnological studies in his last years enabled him to continue the vision he embraced in his early writings in a new way, from a different view and with new revolutionary implications. Following Marx, we might put the emancipation of women this way. Real wealth and the true freedom mean the full unfolding of women's creative powers and potentials, the development of all her capacities, the ability to reproduce herself in her totality, and to seek fulfillment in the open-ended moment of becoming. For women to realize their human possibilities, all domination over their bodies and labor must be eliminated. They can have such freedom only by struggling with the capitalist and patriarchal forms of domination. Hence, Marx's discoveries on the origin of patriarchy in communal societies and his insights about the communal societies of the future can provide social feminists with a new perspective as they explore the sources of women's oppression and the ways of emancipation. Thank you.
Thank you, Melda, and thank you for keeping time very well. May I hand over the word to Wayne?
Howdy, everyone. Tanshi Kiawa, checking in here from Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish land. I'm a first-time caller, long-time listener, and it's happy to be here amongst so many comrades. My remarks are going to run for about 21 minutes, but you're allowed to cut me off. And I apologize in advance, but I'm working on a paper right now, so I might be reading something a bit more traditionally, and I'm very excited to hear your comments and your feedback. I've reproduced some quotes in the chat here, so let me know if you can see them, please. So without further ado, I'm going to talk today about some comparative work that I'm doing between Marx's dissertation and his late work. Kevin already circulated some work that Raya Dunevskaya has written on this, so I know in advance that I've been scooped. But that's unsurprising given how much of a genius she was, and I'm looking forward to seeing how I can improve my remarks. Okay, so without further ado, Marx, Epicurus, and the Mirror, Freedom and Necessity in Marx's Dissertation and Ethnological Notebooks. Antiquity bookends Marx's intellectual life. In 1841, a young and effervescent Marx defends a dissertation on Democritus and Epicurus. More than 40 years later, an aged Marx, weathered from London's drab, rain-soaked climate, spends his terminal years assiduously researching the dissolution of Rome as well as ancient communal forms. But to say that antiquity bookends Marx's life may not be entirely accurate, since he recalls ancient philosophers and poets throughout his oeuvre. Ovid, Xenophon, and especially Aristotle, among many others, figure prominently in his economic treatises. So, evidently, ancient philosophy left an impression on the young Marx, indelibly shaping his intellectual development and even his critique of political economy. Nevertheless, the precise role of ancient philosophy, and indeed Marx's preliminary dissertation, has too often been overlooked or even misinterpreted. The problem is due in part to the fact that Marx's dissertation was not readily accessible until the early 20th century. And additionally, now that we have access to his late notebooks, and because of the important work that the folks are doing over at the Mega, we can, for the first time, really get a survey of all of his works. And I think that's an important insight as well. Marx, even back then, was hard-pressed to find an audience. The Prussian censors forced him to transfer from the University of Berlin to the University of Jena, where he eventually defended in 1841. But there is evidence to suggest that even though Marx completed his dissertation, he did not necessarily see it as final. For instance, in his introduction, Marx writes that the dissertation ought to, quote, be regarded only as the preliminary to a larger work. True to form, that larger work was never completed. And indeed, this may perhaps be the very first time that Marx foreshadows his lifelong idiosyncrasy of leaving grand projects sketched in outline and just over the horizon. Still, snippets of the dissertation appeared subsequently in Bruno Bauer's Journal for the Young Hegelians, Athenaeum, but the complete work was not published until 1927 in the first Marx and Engels Gesamtausgabe. Wider circulation followed. A French translation published by Gallimard appeared in 1968, and the first English translation came out in 1975's Collected Works. Only after these late editions did the dissertation in full become broadly available for scholarly study. Despite its eventual availability, though, the dissertation was still dismissed as juvenilia. Marx's post-1868 notebooks share a similar, circuitous, and repressed history. And I'm not going to rehearse that history right now because our previous speakers did an excellent job at rehearsing that for us. I think the insight that I just want to kind of zero in on is the fact that both the dissertation and the late notebooks share this sort of similar, circuitous, and repressed history. My thesis today is that comparing Marx's uptake of antiquity in his very first and his very last research programs reveals something important about how Marx theorized freedom. In his dissertation, Marx defends Epicurus's notion of the atomic swerve, or the clinamen, as a key entropic mechanism that introduces spontaneity, thereby grounding human freedom against a mechanistic determinism epitomized by Democritus. Likewise, in his late notes on ancient Rome, Marx identifies an aleatory trajectory in which historical development is shaped by contingency and social struggle, rather than by a fixed sequence of necessary stages or modes of production. Marx's early dissertation treats Epicurus's clinamen as an allegory for human freedom within materialism. At the same time, the late notebooks interpret communal forms as concrete historical openings in defiance of the current order. Across these inceptive and terminal thresholds, Marx takes up ancient philosophy not as antiquarian diversion, but as a living resource for grappling with the problem of freedom despite necessity. What's at stake here is how Marx and we conceive freedom itself, the question of what we must be free from, and above all free to actualize. So I have two sections in my remarks. The first section is going to discuss the dissertation, and the last section will discuss the late works. So the dissertation. Even in his youth, Marx appears to have flown too close to the sun. He opens his dissertation with characteristic hubris, declaring that he has solved in it a heretofore unsolved problem in the history of Greek philosophy. The problem with which Marx is concerned is how to disaggregate Democritian and Epicurean philosophical atomism and to avoid reducing Epicurus to a derivative palimpsest of Democritus. Marx challenges centuries of philosophical canon for dismissing the Epicurean Stoics and skeptics, what's known today as the Hellenistic school, as, quote, an almost improper addition to the grandeur of the pre-Socratics and the Aristotelians. Against this powerful historical trend, Marx sets out to rehabilitate Epicurus and, in so doing, to release modern philosophy from the chains of necessity and to reintroduce contingency as the ground of freedom. As Marx writes, quote, Greek philosophy seems to have met with something with which a good tragedy is not supposed to meet, namely a dull ending, end quote. Well, with Epicurus, Marx seeks nothing less than to wrest philosophy from its own tragic ending. For Marx, Democritus stands out as the philosopher of necessity par excellence. He reads Democritus as a skeptic, determinist, and empiricist whose materialism envelops nature and crowds out freedom. As a protege of Leucippus, Democritus developed his mentor's living philosophy of atomism, according to which indivisible atoms governed by necessary laws traverse the void. On this view, everything happens as it must. The sensuous world, by contrast, is mere appearance. What truly exists are atoms and void, while the colors, tastes, and textures we perceive are mere effects of atomic combinations. In an extant fragment, Democritus writes, quote, by convention sweet and by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms and void. Because Democritus dismissed the sensuous world as conventional, he was driven to probe beneath appearances through restless empirical observation and speculation, seeking in natural science the necessary laws undergirding reality. Marx captures this tension between Democritus' skeptical empiricism and mechanistic determinism in chiasmus. And already in the dissertation, we get Marx introducing this rhetorical mechanism, which we all love him for, the chiasmus, right? So in this early one, he writes, quote, the knowledge which he considers true is without content. The knowledge that gives him content is without truth. In other words, Democritus's abstract rationalism provides truth without empirical content, while his empirical observations provide content without any truth. By privileging necessity and abstract explanation, Democritus undermines the possibility of a meaningful relation between human beings and the natural world. His is a philosophy of mechanism and skepticism, but certainly not of freedom, a limitation that sharply contrasts with Epicurus. If Democritus represents necessity, Epicurus emerges for Marx as a figure of freedom. A century after Democritus, Epicurus inherited atomism, but introduced the crucial modification of the clinomen, the unpredictable swerve of the atom. This innovation, according to Marx, broke the chain of strict determinism and opened up a space for individuality, contingency, and ethical agency. However, this radical opening up may perhaps have come at the cost of trading in chains of necessity for vicissitudes of randomness. Quote, the philosopher and dogmatist, and Marx is referring here to Epicurus, who considers appearance to be real, sees everywhere only chance, and his method of explanation tends rather to negate all objective reality of nature. Unlike Democritus, who speculatively dismissed reality as semblance, Epicurus, perhaps dogmatically, affirms appearance as reality, even if unstable and contingent. The clinomen thus becomes a metaphor of freedom within materialism, a way of imagining subjectivity as more than just mechanical necessity. Just as Aeschylus's Prometheus resists Zeus's tyranny, Epicurus resists the determinism of the cosmos, asserting a dogma of freedom despite necessity. Yet Marx's defense of Epicurus is not merely philological. His reflections on freedom and necessity betray a distinctly Hegelian undertone. In his evaluation of Epicurus, Marx writes, and then this is the first quote that I've reproduced in the chat, quote, man ceases to be a product of nature only when the other being to which he relates himself is not a different existence, but is itself an individual human being, even if it is not yet the mind, Geist. But for man as man to become his own real object, he must have crushed within himself his relative being, the power of desire and of mere nature, end quote. Marx's formulation unmistakably echoes Hegel's thesis that self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness, and that freedom is freedom from the determination of nature. So for both Epicurus and Hegel, desire and necessity belong to a deterministic order of nature. So long as the self relates only to mere nature, it remains subject to necessity. Freedom, by contrast, must emerge out of an elevated state of being, a release from natural determination. My interpretive claim is that this elevation from natural determination to recognitive freedom resonates not only within Marx's uptake of Hegel, but also his reading of Epicurus against Democritus. Just as Democritus embodies the determinism of necessity and Epicurus the contingency of clinomen, Hegel presents nature as necessity and recognition as freedom. In both cases, freedom is not found in the satisfaction of desire or in the abstract rejection of necessity, but in the dialectical overcoming of necessity through relation to a recognized other. Moreover, the dissertation foreshadows Marx's critique of abstract freedom, where the opposition between necessity and contingency reemerges as a problem of abstract versus concrete individuality. In the dissertation, Marx describes Epicurus's atom as embodying an abstract individuality, a figure of freedom that is merely negative. For Epicurus, the atom is free only insofar as it swerves away from necessity, cut off from relations with others. As Marx puts it, quote, freedom from being, not freedom in being. Indeed, this dissertation anticipates Marx's later critique of bourgeois rights in the Jewish question, where abstract freedom, freedom that is, of the isolated individual before the law, masks a deeper unfreedom rooted in social and material alienation. Across both of these texts, then, Marx's point remains the same. Genuine freedom is not found in separation from being, but in its transformation, not in abstract individuality, but in concrete and social self-actualization. So this contrast between abstract and concrete freedom raises a further question, though. Could Marx have reconciled necessity and freedom, as well as Democritus and Epicurus, by adopting a compatibilist stance? Compatibilism is the philosophical position that determinism and freedom are not mutually exclusive. Even if prior causes determine all events, human beings can still act freely in a meaningful sense. A compatibilist Marx could have reconciled Democritus and Epicurus by arguing that even if atoms obey natural laws, human freedom consists in acting according to one's own nature within those laws. In other words, determinism, Democritus, need not cancel out freedom, Epicurus. In fact, determinism could be freedom's very condition. But in the dissertation, Marx explicitly resists such reconciliation. Instead, he insists upon Democritus and Epicurus' shared lexicon of atoms and void, as well as their identical scientific method, similarities that nevertheless stand diametrically opposed. The result is that, quote, these men who contradict each other on all points seem to be chained to each other, and his metaphor here conspicuously invokes Prometheus. Marx's refusal of compatibilism is telling then. It shows that the young Marx was working in a particular Hegelian mode, one in which truth emerges not from reconciliation, but from negation and supersession. His concern was less to mediate determinism and freedom than to position them as antinomies. Democritus, the figure of necessity, versus Epicurus, the figure of freedom. In the dissertation, then, Marx cast the struggle between necessity and freedom onto the stage of ancient philosophy. In his late notebooks, he will return to this stage once more, but now to reimagine history itself as a terrain of contingency, struggle, and possibility. So now I'm going to move on to the late Marx. If in 1841, Marx found in Epicurus' Clinamen a philosophical figure for freedom against determinism, in his late notebooks, he turned to ancient history to locate similar openings within concrete and historical social forms. Rather than atoms swerving in the void, though, we encounter clans, communes, and plebeians, entire classes who destabilize any linear pathway of development. This through line from Marx's earliest to his latest works show that the late Marx remained the dialectical iconoclast of his youth, someone who still wrestled with the Promethean problematic of freedom despite necessity. It is no accident, then, that Marx's late reflections turned to Rome, where the fate of the plebeians, like Epicurus' Clinamen, revealed how necessity could be broken by contingency, contradiction, and struggle, reminding us that what is ultimately at stake is the very meaning of freedom. Marx investigates the dispossession of Rome's plebeian class, placing their decline within a broader comparative study of communal forms and class transitions across world history. The passage below captures his historical method at its sharpest, beginning with free peasants, moving through their expropriation, and concluding with the distinctive trajectory of Roman society, which produced neither modern wage labor nor capitalism, but a degraded social formation grounded in slavery. And now I'm going to read a quote from his late notes, and this quote is, of course, reproduced in Kevin's earlier book, Marx at the Margins, so he will know this very well. This is what Marx writes.
In 2 minutes left. Can you wrap up within 2 minutes?
I have 16 on my clock, but yeah, sure, why not? Quote, at various points in Capital, I have alluded to the fate that befell the plebeians of ancient Rome. They were originally free peasants, each tilling his own plot on his own behalf. In the course of Roman history, they were expropriated. The same movement that divorced them from their means of production and subsistence involved the formation not only of large landed property, but also of big money capitals. Thus, one fine morning, there were, on one side, free men stripped of everything but their labor power, and on the other, in order to exploit their labor power, owners of all the acquired wealth. What happened? The Roman proletarians became not wage laborers, but an idle mob, more abject than those who used to be called poor whites of the southern United States, and what unfolded alongside them was not a capitalist, but a slave mode of production. I'll skip to the conclusion. At first glance, Marx's 1841 dissertation and his 1879 to 1882 notebook seem worlds apart. One is speculative, and the other is empirical. It is a set of empirical studies of clan societies, Rome, India, and the Russian Mir. Yet beneath this difference in register lies a striking continuity. In both moments, Marx employs ancient and communal forms to grapple with the relationship between necessity and freedom, determinism and contingency. The early dissertation dramatizes this opposition through the allegorical figures of Democritus and Epicurus. At the same time, the late notebooks revisit this problem empirically, exploring the contradictions of communal property, slavery, proto-racism, as well as multilinear pathways of development. What changes is not the problematic itself, but its articulation, from abstract philosophy to concrete ethnography, from speculative allegory to empirical history. Taken together, these two thresholds of Marx's career show that his engagement with antiquity was never antiquarian. And this is the last paragraph. The point then is methodological. The late Marx does not abandon dialectics, he deepens it by embedding contingency and multilinearity in history itself. Ancient philosophy and ancient society alike serve him as laboratories for thinking freedom, not as an abstract escape from necessity, but as a determinate transformation through struggle, recognition, and collective self-determination. As Marx says in the appendix to the dissertation, quote, "The practice of philosophy is itself theoretical. It is the critique that measures the individual existence by the essence, the particular reality by the idea." Thank you.